we saw sort of a little window into what happens probably sometimes behind the scenes, in front of the camera, because we have a looming government shutdown.
That's right. We are 9 days away from a possible government shutdown after President Trump and the Democratic leadership appeared to reach an impasse on funding for border security yesterday.
The president sparred with both the House and Senate minority leaders, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, in the Oval Office. He even promised to take responsibility for a government shutdown, saying that he would be proud to do so if he doesn't receive adequate funding for a wall along the Mexican border.
20 times you have called for, I will shut down the government if I don't get my wall. None of us have said.
You want to know something?
You've said it.
Okay, you want to put that on my...
You've said it.
I'll take it.
Okay, good.
You know what I'll say? Yes. If we don't get what we want, one way or the other, whether it's through you, through a military, through anything you want to call, I will shut down the government.
Okay,
absolutely.
fair enough.
And I am proud, and I'll tell you what,
disagree.
I am proud to shut down the government for border security, Chuck, because the people of this country don't want criminals and people that have lots of problems and drugs pouring into our country. So I will take the mantle. I will be the one to shut it down. I'm not going to blame you for it.
All right, so CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe is here. So glad that you're joining us this morning. Ed, so you heard the president talk about, you know, if it's for border security, he'll take the blame for a government shutdown. Democrats want the president to take responsibility for the government shutdown, so it worked out. I think when you saw their faces, especially Chuck Schumer, suddenly there was a little grin on his face and he stopped talking. They're actually calling it the Trump shutdown, the Democrats are. Is this a winning issue for the president, though, to say that he'll cause a government shutdown over border security? Is this what his supporters want to hear?
His supporters want to hear that. Whether it's ultimately a win for him or for Democrats or for whoever, I think remains to be seen, and depends on whether we even have a shutdown and for how long it might last if it happens. That was an incredible scene yesterday. I actually happened to be having lunch and was watching you guys on my mobile device, as we encourage people to do, and I think I hooted and hollered at one point in just total amazement at what was going on there for 17 minutes in the Oval Office. We got a little British, if you will, there in the White House, watching these guys just completely go at it. And yet, what we saw there is exactly the argument that is befuddling Washington yet again, this showdown. We've had this fight now, 3 or 4 times since Trump became president, and what was fascinating about this one is usually we see representatives of the president and representatives of or rank and file Democrats having that argument on television or in person. We've never seen the principals do it in the way that they did yesterday. And I think it totally encapsulates not only the argument over whether or not it's proper to spend billions of dollars building a wall, but also a real example of what divided government might conceivably look like in the coming 2 years, where you're going to see this kind of confrontation. The president is not used to this. He's never had lawmakers come to the Oval Office and spar with him quite the way they did. And as you could see, he was willing to give it back to them and in some ways appeared to relish the disagreement that they had.
You know, Ed, it's interesting to me listening to the president there make some of the comments that he made, make his case for why we need border security. Some of the language that he used has been called out. It was called out by Chuck Schumer yesterday. It was called out by the Washington Post with the Pinocchio system that they have now, which now includes an unlimited number of Pinocchios for the things that the president might say that turn out not to be true, including the fact that people that are trying to cross into the border or trying to cross into the United States have communicable diseases. He used the language of catching 10 terrorists, where numerous national security organizations have said that's simply not true, that in fact since the 450 cases of jihadist terrorism that have occurred in the United States since 9/11, not one has been as a result of somebody crossing from our southern border. So the president is using this language around the border security issue to try and gin up support for his base. I want to play this exchange during the meeting between President Trump and the leaders. Listen.
If I needed the votes for the wall in the House, I would have them in one session. It would be done.
Go do it.
It doesn't help because we need 10 Democrats in the Senate.
Don't put it on the Senate. Put it on the negotiation.
Okay, let me ask you this, and we're doing this in a very friendly manner. It doesn't help for me to take a vote in the House where I will win easily with the Republicans.
You will not win. The fact is, you do not have the votes in the House.
Nancy, I do. And we need border security. Nancy.
So You were watching us yesterday, Ed. I was talking to Major Garrett after this. We were both astounded by what we had just witnessed, as you were. And Major did point out that the president and Speaker Pelosi are, in a way, both right. The president talking about what would be needed to get it passed in the Senate. But I want to focus on the House. Nancy Pelosi is directly telling the president of the United States, you do not have the votes, even with your own party, because you don't have enough Republicans willing to sign on for it. Is that correct?
It appears to be, because if they did have the votes, they'd probably have held the vote by now. And you wonder, why wouldn't Republicans support the $5 billion border plan the president wants? Because while there are several dozen House Freedom Caucus and other conservative members who support that or are willing to vote for it, there are dozens of others who don't necessarily. And many of them just lost their jobs. And there's a distinct possibility that some of those Republicans who lost their jobs, moderates, who might want a future in politics, or who certainly don't agree with the president on this, simply might not show up to vote when these votes are held. They don't have to at this point, really. And in essence, they're registering their opposition to the idea by not showing up at all. So when Pelosi says you don't have the votes, you don't have 218 votes in the House, we are led to believe that is the case. There is a possibility by the end of this week that Republicans try to call her bluff and hold the vote and see whether or not they can do it. But even holding it would potentially prove to the president, she's right. You don't have enough votes for $5 billion. You've got to come up with another plan. The $1.3 billion offer from the Democrats that's sitting there might be the only feasible way to ward off this potential shutdown. If you go back to the beginning of the conversation that we witnessed yesterday, the president repeatedly said, we've got to have border security. And he kept touting the fact that parts of the wall are already being built. To me, and to many others, I think that was a signal. He knows, potentially, he's not going to get the $5 billion. So he was laying down some markers and saying, well, look, even if we don't get what I'm asking for, we are making progress. And we may ultimately see him have to make that argument, that we got a little more, we're going to continue building it. He's been talking about the possibility of making the military do it. I don't think they really can do that. But he was trying to lay out expectations there if he falls short.
So, Ed, I want to ask you about something else. The president sort of needled Nancy Pelosi about whether or not she could be speaking for the party. He was alluding to a Speaker of the House vote that's coming up and whether or not she would be able to achieve that position again. What do you know? You've been doing some reporting on that.
Yeah, remember, Pelosi, once the new House convenes in January, also needs 218 votes to become Speaker. And while a majority of the House Democratic caucus voted for her in their private meeting 2 weeks ago, she still didn't get 218 votes, even in that private meeting, that would assure her the support she needs. And so she's had to go to what we're calling the rebels, those that didn't vote for her, to essentially try to pick some of them off and figure out, well, what would it take to get their vote? One of the things that's being negotiated, it's not final, we believe we may learn more about it by the end of the week, is a plan that would essentially set a time limit on how much longer she would serve as Speaker. No more than 4 more years. It is a retroactive deal that essentially says somebody can only be Speaker for 3 terms. Well, she served 2 already during the Bush years. If she gets this one, that would be her 3rd. The way she would get a 4th is she would have to go to her caucus and 2/3 of them would have to vote to support her. She didn't get 2/3, I don't believe, or barely got 2/3 in that first round just a few weeks ago. And so the marker is set. And essentially it says we're near the end now, potentially, of a Pelosi speakership. That would address the concern of dozens of Democrats who say, we love her, she does a great job, look at what she did at the White House yesterday, but it's time for the next generation to be able to step up. And so essentially, if that agreement is agreed to, a transition would almost immediately begin, and you'd start to see jockeying among younger members to potentially replace her one day.
One thing this meeting yesterday proved, Ed and Marie, it's going to be a really interesting 2 years. Ed O'Keefe in Washington
Totally.
for us. Yeah, thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Buckle up.
Yeah, exactly right.